Thanks, Kure, and thanks, Ameza, and all of you for joining me on what is a jet-lagged Monday morning for me, and probably a lovely early spring evening for the rest of you in most of Europe. So I really appreciate that you're willing to meet in the evening. It made it a little bit more comfortable for me. I'm delighted that my long-term co-conspirator, Teo Meda, is here watching. He's been really the one of the driving forces behind the intelligent search engine for belief legends. We've had the absolute pleasure of collaborating now for over 5 years on this project, and along with Holger Meyer and Christoph Schmidt at the Vosidlo archive in Rostock, and we've been working with these challenges of trying to integrate uh, uh, data from different folklore archival collections. And so we've focused on largely textual data and generically focused on belief legend, which of course is a very fluid genre, but we definitely needed some boundaries on what you'll see as an incredibly challenging problem, but one that is going to be important for archives, particularly folklore archives, as we move forward into this 21st century. Some of the questions that we have is how do we search across many different archives, particularly when they're in different languages, different orthographies, dialects, and then what can we do with those results that we return from a search over some arbitrary collection of folklore data. So that, in the, sort of the grand scheme of things, is what we're trying to do. Develop search methods that will allow us to search either very broadly across multiple data sets, which is often called federated search. So I search once and I get results from many different data resources. And then how can I do that consistently with a reasonable amount of accuracy and confidence in my results? So when in information science and information retrieval, they often talk about both precision, so you get lots of results that answer precisely your question, but also recall, so that you're getting a broader scope of results that aren't precisely related to your search, but actually could be positive results over your search. So we want to have a search engine that allows the end user to perhaps adjust these questions of both precision and recall over some large set of data that we know is on some level, and for lack of a better term, about the same thing, right? So we want to be able to search for things like witchcraft. We want to be able to search for things like witches who have some relationship to butter. But I'd also like to know what other types of perhaps supernatural or preternatural figures have some relationship to butter, maybe only in Denmark, maybe across all of Scandinavia, maybe across all of Northern Europe. So that's sort of a brief introduction as to what the challenges are for this type of search engine. Um, so this is the collaborative project with the Mertens Institute, Uni Rostock, and now UC Berkeley. You'll see that it actually started off at UCLA, but it moved with me when I moved to Berkeley. So I need a new logo. There we go. Got my new logo. Uh, and the motivation is predicated on the notion that folklore is really one of the first big data fields in the humanities. And given its data-driven analysis of informal cultural expressive forms. I'm not sure why certain words are not, millions of variants of informal expressive culture that circulate on and across social networks. So this is kind of our working definition of folklore, is informal expressive culture circulating on and across social networks. And it's important to formulate it that way because this gets buy-in from people from other disciplines. When people hear folklore, they often think, what's the importance of that? But if we can express it in this context, we can both bring attention to the importance of folklore across centuries, but we can also help people from other disciplines help us start to conceptualize the research problems as well as the methodological problems that might be involved in developing multilingual search engines for informal cultural expressive data. And of course, it's at a very large scale. Our archives that we've been working with are really at the level of hundreds of thousands of stories and data points. But really, if we expand this, we'll be very quickly up in the realm of millions, and that actually would start to qualify as a big data problem. And as we know, folklore has been collected and archived throughout the world. The archives provide access. They support research into similarities and differences in archival collections of expressive cultural traditions, which support studies across broad geographic distributions, broad range of linguistic diversity, and so those are also these challenges that we're working with. How can I look at expressive culture not only from a single sort of national geographic area, because we all know that that's what motivated a lot of the early archival collections. They tended to be national collections, even though these boundaries, of course, don't necessarily limit the movement of cultural expressive forms. Of course, so they're a completely fictional boundary, and there may be other ways of sort of partitioning these broad geographic areas. And then linguistic diversity, right? So when we find these contact areas, we find that there's also some very interesting things going on with the shift across linguistic boundaries. And it may be gradual, or it may be actually quite abrupt. So those are the things that we want to be able to interrogate. And the way that we're going to do this is try to bring together all of these archival resources that have been developed over the past 150 years. So there's some challenges for that. So we worked, of course, with the Dutch and the Flemish material that Theo has been working on now for quite a while, and the remarkable tools that they've been able to develop at Meertens. The Vosidia, the digital Vosidlo archive in Uni Rostock, which has an even more difficult challenge because the underlying stories have to be reconstructed through a graph model of the cards in the card catalog. So the sort of folk expression was broken up into cards, and now the idea is to generate hypergraphs that bring the cards together as a representation of a folk expressive form. And then the much more modest material that I've been working on independently from Denmark, the Evaltang Christensen collection. And as you can see in all of these different projects, geography has become one of the tropes that we use as a way of representing both the location and the distribution of expressive culture across these three Northern European areas. So the main tasks for developing ISEBEL, and we worked on this actually took about a year to figure out what the actual main tasks were. We needed to understand the existing data structures in these three digital archives. We needed to develop a harvester, something that could go and ask each archive independently, what is a minimal representation of the data that you're able to share with all of the other archives, right? So we had to figure out a way to make a central computer go around and knock on the door of each of the archives and say, hi, tell me which data you can share, and then let's make sure that it's represented in such a way that it'll be able to be shared across all three of these archives. And then we had to develop a method because each of these archives, the original archival information is in a different language than the other archives. We had to develop methods for searching across those multiple languages. So the idea is to search once, and get results from all of the archives. And then we wanted to integrate the results, and this is where we are right now, integrating the results with different types of analytic approaches, right? So it's not just a visual representation, but we're going to do something that helps us understand the interrelationships, the interdependence of both storytellers and the stories they tell, as well as the role of collectors in the sort of geographic distribution of these stories or story topics, right? So I don't just want to have, a keyword search. I also want to be able to search across the data in such a way that I can aggregate topics even if the keywords aren't present in those stories. I want to visualize the results in an engaging manner because we have publics that we have to serve. And I say publics plural deliberately because we've got researchers, we've got students, and we've also got the general interested population. And then we want to expand our visualizations to include non-point-based visualizations. So much of what you see right now are point-based visualizations, and that's actually often a misrepresentation of what the underlying data is trying to tell us. So here's a little framework that I've been working with some French colleagues on, sort of trying to understand if this might be something that we could also work with in the context of all of these different datas. This is what's called a multimodal network representation, and there are ways to filter that as well. So how can we do this? We've got all these challenges from each of the diverse archives. The Vosidlo archive has all of these research notes compiled by Ricard Vosidlo, and all different types of data. It's highly heterogeneous. Correspondents would send in notes, and then he would excerpt the notes onto these little cards, and then those cards would go into the catalog. And sort of our challenge is, can we not only reconstruct the notes of the correspondent, but can we extract the individual expressive forms that the correspondent was collecting in those? So we developed a global conceptual schema as a way of integrating all of the different data that was going to be coming from each of the different databases. And so this is work largely by the computer science department at Uni Rostock. Holger Meyer was leading that team to develop both schema matching, schema integration, and schema mapping. And so each local data set has to be expressed using the global model. And so that's actually kind of a challenge because each archive has its own archiving regime, and we have to find a common language. This is actually a multilingual computer problem. We have to find a common language that will map between each of the data collections that the local archive feels is a responsible representation of their data and yet can be generalized so that we can work with it across all of the different sets. So we came up with some baseline facts about persons, places, events, keywords, things like that. And we composed all of these micro formats for each one of the archival data sets. And that became the subject of our conversation to create an XML schema that would allow us to harvest from each one of the archives, right? So each one of the archives has its own representation of the data. We then put in an interpreter that says, well, what would that be like? How would you express that in this general language? Once we could get those schemas aligned, and that took probably a little over a year, we were then able to integrate this with this OAI, Open Archive Initiative, PMH data harvester and model, right? So for each archive here in this blue layer, there's a local export schema, and it becomes an OAI data provider. And then we have an OAI service provider that comes and harvests every night all of the data from each one of these data providers, and it puts it then into the full ISEBEL uh, um, shared representation, and that's what we actually do the searching on. Now, once you've searched on it and you get your results, the goal is to actually be able to go all the way back through linked open data to the original record in the target archive. So this is what a simple record looks like once we've interpreted the, in this case, the Eva Tangherlini data and made it ready for harvesting. So each night the Tangherlini uh, archive asks, has anything changed? If something has changed, it updates the output, and it says, hey, we're ready for harvesting. And ISEBEL, the harvester, comes by in the evening and just picks up that file and then reads that back into the ISEBEL shared database. And then we have some keywords. I'll talk briefly about those as well. This is what we're working with from Sagnagrunna. So we got this working with the Icelandic material. It didn't take terribly long to get the Sagnagrunna Icelandic material to then conform to this OAI PMH harvester material, and now we can just go through and harvest the Icelandic material, and then that becomes indexed and available for search in ISEBEL itself. An important thing that we've been discussing is the idea that all the data providers have to maintain local control of their collections. So that means each local archive can decide what is available for harvesting and what is not available for harvesting. And so this was actually one of the main discussions as well, because each archival resource has a regime of permissions. And, you know, it might be that say in Sweden, certain things are accessible to Swedes, but not to non-Swedish IP addresses. So we have to be aware of that. And so each local archive can sort of build in what gets exposed to the international harvester. So that's actually a really huge challenge. That is not a trivial challenge, and one that I think and Theo will attest to this. We had many hours of conversations about this, and I think we've now, with the idea that each local archive installs their own ISEBEL node or their own OAI PMH node, then there's local control over what is and what isn't being harvested. So here's an example of a very simple ISEBEL search. You can see I've put in devil, and for devil, it turns out Northern Europe is infested with devils. And you can see that we've got them coming thousands and thousands from the Netherlands, and thousands from Denmark, and a smaller number perhaps from Vosidia. But you can see that actually, if you noticed, I searched in English, but I'm getting my results in Danish, and there's other results in Dutch and other results in German. And you can see that the keyword that is coming up is actually in the target language, and this means to curse, right? And we also get Cyprianus. So there's something going on here that is expanding the search, right? So remember, it's not just precision. I'm not only getting records that mention the devil, but I'm also getting records that may have, in some way, in that local archive, been categorized as associated with the devil, right? So there's a recall over the records here as well. If I further go into that search, I have now sort of clicked on devil in the Danish, and I'm getting 263 results specifically for the Danish keyword devil. But you can see I still have more results than just 263. So that's sort of a recall over the material. And recall I've only searched in English at this point. And then I can go all the way down to the actual story here, and I can see metadata about it. And right now this link is not working. I have to change these links to the Berkeley site because I had to move all of the material. But if I were to click on that link, it would bring me to the actual archive itself. So it's deep linking to the target archives as well. So here we can see the Dutch keyword is, I'm going to need Theo's pronunciation here.
That's Dovel.
There we go. And you see we're getting 2,401 results there for the Dutch keyword, right? So Djevel and Duivel is giving us results as well. So how do we do that? We've spent a lot of time thinking about how to do multilingual search and taking a lot of cues from things like Google and another company called DeepL. So what we're doing is we're translating making dirty translations in the background of all of this material. At first, we were doing pairwise translations, but computationally, not only was it very expensive, but it was not as accurate. So we do a pairwise into English dirty translation, which is now kind of sitting hidden. And if you search in English, you'll get a search over all of the English dirty translations and their corresponding target languages. If you search in Danish, for example, it's going to search all of the Danish tales, but then it's going to make a jump over to the English, and then it searches all of the English tales for the non-Danish tales. So it's sort of a little bit of a shortcut, and then it returns results in the other languages. The results are getting really good. Kure had sent me some links to some Norwegian tales that were incredibly well, really clean texts. And then we ran those through a neural translation model, and the results were unusually good. But I think that's because the texts were so clean. But we're getting extremely good results on these neural translation models, where we're fine-tuning the model to take into account folklore vocabulary. And so that's something that we sort of bootstrapped early on by making a list of words that never translated properly, and having experts go in and annotate that word list. We then fed that word list into our neural machine translation model and sort of shifted the model a little bit. So now that the model was aware not only of, say, parliamentary records, but also of folklore. It's sort of like this folklore-aware translation model. And that's what allows us to do this multilingual search. So this is, for example, a view of a word map where we've projected all of the words into 780 dimensions and then reduce that dimensionality. And so you get this beautiful topography of words related to other words. And if we search for Nisse, we'll find that this is a multilingual model, right? So we'll find that Nisse actually here is close to drive like a carriage. It's close to the baker. It's close to farm animals and other things that are very, very close to farms. But it's also close to things like robbers and in English thieves, because of course Nisse are thieving little bastards who upset the farm so much. So it's a remarkable thing that we can take these two different languages and map them into a similar space, and we can use this proximity. See right here in English, farmhands and Nisse, right? Of course, that makes an awful lot of sense from the Scandinavian perspective of Nisse being sort of a little Nils, sort of the supernatural farmhand associated with the farm. So, and then of course not too far over here to Elefa. So we can find these similarity spaces in this high dimensional model of language, and we can use that then as a way to expand our search and our understanding of the space. Here are some of the this is early on. This is some of our early experiments, and if you see here, the earliest versions didn't work very well. Uh, this one actually is surprisingly good, and this is a gold standard, sort of done by hand. Uh, and you can see that they're getting surprisingly good, so good that for a researcher, that level of comprehension would be helpful to support research questions. Current work is really trying to integrate OAI PMH. Well, apart from Teo's boundless energy and endless search for additional funds for ISEBEL, which I really have to commend. Teo's doing incredible work trying to get this continued funding. And then, of course, the Samla project in Norway, which I'm delighted to be part of, and is trying to think towards sort of a pan-Nordic view. Kind of, we're calling it Nord Isabel for short, I think. We'll be talking about that in Reykjavik. Some of the things that we want to do in the archive is have better visualizations and better what I call analytics. We want to be able to go all the way down to the manuscript level and see the initial handwritten records, because there's a lot of stuff going on in those handwritten records, crossouts, emendations. But there's actually a really easy thing to integrate, which is the IIIF standard, and pretty much every librarian and archivist is aware of IIIF, so that we can integrate these IIIF viewers into the search results of ISEBEL, so that you could go all the way down to the manuscript level. I did some early experiments with different ways of representing geographic data, so that it wasn't simply point frequency representations, which we often see because it's built into a lot of the search stack is to have either a little pointer with a bunch of numbers on it telling you how many records are in that area, but also to generate some kind of idea of a heat map, so that we get a sense of the distribution, because we know that people aren't just anchored to the ground. They've got some sort of spread into the countryside. And right now, my colleague Pete Broadwell and I are thinking about different heat kernels and different models of decay for a story. How far does a story travel, basically? How far away is the distance that people have some sort of interaction, so there could be some likelihood that others would hear them tell their story. What do transportation networks do to that over time? And then, of course, what happens when you get different communication methods? So we're playing around with these kinds of things, different ways of classifying, also basically understanding the relationship between an individual and the topics that they talk about in their storytelling. So this is, where are witches in the Danish landscape? And if we were to put all of the storytellers standing on each other's shoulders, how far away do they conceptualize witches being? Not very far away. Where are they? Everywhere. So if you're afraid of witches, don't go to Denmark. Certainly not in the 19th century, because this sort of little map shows that they are everywhere and they're really close. But that makes sense theoretically as well. Then we also started working with sort of topic modeling. Given any area in Denmark, what are the most likely topics that you're going to encounter in that area? And then what other areas in Denmark have similar distributions of topics? And so, for example, we take this area here, and we can see that there are the highest thing that we're finding way out here in eastern Jutland is Nisse, ghosts or revenants, and portents. And ministers and haunts are much lower down on the scale, and then landscapes and ministers as well. And then we find these other areas that have similar distributions of topics for a region. And then we have to think about ways we create regions. And so there are all sorts of kind of analytics that we can do. I already mentioned that we want to integrate the existing Nordic country collections. We've been working with Sagna Grunner, obviously working with Samla. We've got a workshop coming up in November. We'll have another workshop in the spring, um, to try and see if we can stand something up, an experimental, and understand the problems, of course, as well. Uh, we want to develop very clear methods for archives to expose their data to the harvester so that any archive can just download a package and then install it, and probably within a day or two have the OAI PMH harvester node running, and very quickly get the keywords aligned with the ISEBEL keywords, so that they could then just send us an email and say, hey, we're ready for harvesting, and then that would be immediately incorporated into the ISEBEL environment. We want to work on arbitrary search languages. That's actually a really hard challenge. Have any, series of search terms in any language that you want, and return all of the different records across those different archival resources in one interface. And we also want that you to be able to download locally those records so that you can work with them locally. I think that's very important. And then have other visual analytic representations, as well as some computational methods for understanding things like topic distribution, as I showed you there with ElfYelp. And then, of course, just an open call for more archives to join. I think Teo's vision has always been, one large integrated folklore archival system where we could all take advantage of each other's incredible work, and so that we can also make it accessible to all ranges of people, from researchers to students to the interested public. So that's all I have to say.